Recording in progress.
So we'll just make sure. So we have very upward of almost 30 people with us on Zoom. So you never know. And I'll just that will pick up the sound, and Joey may let you know if we can't hear you. And I'll let you.
Great, I think Judy's going to do an intro.
Great. That sounds good. Judy, are you ready?
I am. Should I come up there?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect.
I'm just going to speak very briefly to save time for Keith. Keith is the former executive director of the Newport Chamber of Commerce, the State Office of Economic Development. He's very involved in historic preservation. He's currently the Director of Economic and Business Development for the City of Providence. He co-authored the Matter of Truth report, which you're going to hear about today, which is part of the City of Providence's Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations initiative. And I'm going to save all other remarks and questions for afterwards because Keith has to skip out right at 11:45. So please give your attention to Keith.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to present the research and documentation that went into the creation of the Matter of Truth report. Let me apologize up front that I'm going to present about 4 centuries of history in about 30-40 minutes. I will certainly make available my contact information through Judy. If anyone has even more in-depth questions, comments, information to share, we're spending a lot of time following up with as many people across the state, and particularly across the city, what we think is this very important work. As Judy said, I had the privilege to be the co-author and the original drafter of the Matter of Truth report. The Matter of Truth report was initiated by Mayor Alonzo several years ago as a part of what was called a truth, reconciliation, and reparations process with the City of Providence. Providence has now become one of several cities and several states in the nation to lead an effort in designing and developing a comprehensive reparative justice investment strategy, particularly to make amends to those indigenous and African heritage people who have been impacted by centuries of racial discrimination. The process began through what is called Truth, and I was engaged working with a number of local, state, and national historical institutions to compile literally an assessment on the history of racialized discrimination in the City of Providence, the state of Rhode Island. The Matter of Truth report, as I'll walk you through, was comprised of 7 sections that begins with the 17th century founding period and then ends in 2020. In fact, we now have received national recognition and certainly national inquiries to the fact that we're one of the few cities in America that's taking such a comprehensive approach to racial reparations. So in this process, it's important that I recognize the participants who led this research effort. This was led by the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. Rhode Island Black Heritage Society is one of the oldest and largest societies in the country, dating back to 1975. We worked very closely with the Rhode Island Historical Society, City Archives, State Archives. I can't tell you the opportunities we had of having access to thousands of items that were largely digitized and made available during COVID epidemic of access for our utilization and research. The most, I think, important aspect of this report, separate from the narrative, that is compiles over 650 primary, secondary sources of information. So the bibliography alone is now being used by scholars and other interested parties as an ability for them to further explore, learn, and understand this very comprehensive and also very compelling history. So let me begin with the very, I think, starting point of this discussion of racialized discrimination. I think we all know the story of the founding Rhode Island from Providence in 1636 with Roger Williams, and then later in the next several years, what is today Portsmouth, Newport, my home on Aquinic Island by 1639. But I think what's most important is that the very early settlement and arrival of European explorers in the early 17th century, it begins with the exploration of the Atlantic coast, literally from Maine to Cape Cod. And during that early part of that 17th century, as those explorers are arriving and exploring the coast, they're interacting for the first time with indigenous populations. And what we find during that period of time, the documentation that we've been able to assemble, is that this first contact between Europeans leaving the old world and landing in the new world, their first contact with indigenous people, we find that they're arriving during the early 16th and 17th centuries at a time that Europe was still embroiled in significant pandemics. So it's ironic today that we still are fighting through the COVID-19 pandemic. If this was early 17th century New England, it would be the arrivals of Europeans that would bring the first great pandemic to the Americas, what was called the Great Dying. Between 1616 and 1619, that 3-year period of time of expiration, nearly 80 to 85% of the indigenous tribes, men, women, family, and children that lived along the coast from Maine to Cape Cod died from European diseases. Diseases today that we recognize as smallpox, in some cases malaria traveling via the West Indies. But what's most important to understand is that the earliest arrival of the Europeans nearly wipes clean the slate of indigenous people who had occupied this land and these lands for generations and generations and centuries. And as these Europeans would arrive and settle and establish what would become the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Rhode Island Colony, Connecticut colonies, and others, they brought with them, particularly in New England, this strong impulse of religious freedom. I mean, their whole purpose of arriving here is they're not Spanish conquerors, Portuguese explorers, French trappers. They're largely Protestant Christian men, women, and families who are leaving the old world and eventually leaving the Massachusetts Bay Colony to simply find a place where they could worship God freely without having a king or a queen or a royal governor overseeing. Us in Rhode Island, that story is Roger Williams, and that story of the lively experiment, and the establishment of one of the earliest colonies, English colonies, under the tenets of what we call religious freedom. What's important to understand is that that belief system, that belief of expressing yourself freely and finally having a place to live, work, and worship freely would soon evolve into an economic notion and a notion that this land was now available to us. And one of the earliest justifications to these primary documents that we find is that we find leaders in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut colony starting to compare themselves and actually calling this new land English Israel, and comparing their exploration, their colonization, their rights to own and build upon the land with or without the existing indigenous people as an act of God. This pestilence that swept away most of the pagan natives was an act of God. This bountiful land that's just made available for us to take and put up fences and bring livestock and use and manage was made available through God. We are God's children. So it's important to understand that you have this significant action between achieving religious freedom and prosperity and then building an economic system, all simultaneously going on. And it sets the stage by the middle of the 17th century as Providence is now being established, followed by Portsmouth, Newport, Warwick, as the colony of Rhode Island is starting to take shape. You're beginning to have this sense that this land needs to be cultivated, and we begin to need labor to cultivate this land. And you begin to see nearly almost simultaneously with the establishment and the colonization of Rhode Island and at Providence, the importation of enslaved Africans, initially coming from Barbados and Jamaica, and then eventually by the 18th century, a full-fledged transatlantic system. So when we talk about the very founding and settlement of the Americas, but particularly Providence, Rhode Island, it's directly tied to two basic premises: indigenous people land and enslaved African people labor. Free land, free labor. That's a pretty good start to build an economic system anywhere at any time in the history of the world. And as we begin talking about the arrival of enslaved Africans, I'm very proud to the fact that one of the things that we were able to do was to be able to put together very comprehensive documentation of what the actual Rhode Island Providence participation in the slave trade was. In fact, one of the aspects of this report is we now have 935 documented slave voyages between 1705 and 1805 directly tied to Rhode Island merchants. We now have that database. And if we to break that down for you, 75% of those voyages come from Newport by community. So if we're talking about the most active participants in British North America in the transatlantic slave trade, it's Newport. And if we break it down by merchants and vessels and participants, it's really all over the board. It's really patently unfair to be able to identify a single merchant, a single vessel, a single religion, a single participant The best way to describe it is that the transatlantic slave trade and the participation of African enslavement was the world's first and truest equal opportunity employer. Anyone and everyone in Rhode Island participated at some level, some more adept than others. In fact, the earliest participants are Quakers, because Quakers dominate the population and landscape and the leadership of early 17th into early 18th century Rhode Island. And then later they're followed by every other religious group, including some of the Sephardic Jews that arrived. But it's important to understand this is a system that's not based on religion, race, or ethnicity. It's based on power and privilege. And by the end of the 18th century, Rhode Island is at the very center of this trade. And in fact, one of the things that we're able to call out with Providence's participation in the transatlantic slave trade, it really doesn't take off until after the American Revolution. And what's even more fascinating is it's not a transatlantic trade. Providence is participating in African enslavement and transportation, is not sending ships solely from Providence to West Africa, to West Indies, and then from West Indies back to Providence. After the American Revolution, where it's largely outlawed by the new state of Rhode Island, the soon-to-be city of Providence, and the now United States, it is now an illegal action. And now you have Providence, Bristol, and other merchants now actively involved in illegal transportation. And they're sending ships not to West Africa, but to the West Indies. In fact, it's Cuba that is a significant participant of Providence and Bristol merchants. They're taking enslaved African men and women in Cuba and transporting them directly, not to Rhode Island and New England, but directly to the plantations of the Carolinas and Georgia. So again, it helped us to understand the system and who participated in the system. But what's most important to understand is that Rhode Island during the colonial era is a leader in British North America, in British English African transportation. And those Africans who had arrived, most importantly, arrived under a unique circumstance. They arrived where, for the most part, these Africans, even though we had at one time plantations in our name, our agricultural-based economy was relatively limited because of the lack of land, soil, and weather. So the cash crops that were really driving an international 18th century economies such as sugar, rice, coffee, tobacco, later cotton, those things aren't growing in Rhode Island. Our soil is mostly sand and shale. So for the most part, enslaved Africans, alongside enslaved and later indigenous people, are working on some of the smaller farms in what today we call South County, at one point Washington County, Narragansett County, even in places like Smithfield, Little Compton, Portsmouth. But most of the enslaved Africans were working, living, worshiping, eventually dying in the urban seaports. And not only here in Rhode Island, but we see it in New London, Boston, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So working in these urban seaports, they're largely being trained in the trade skills. So you have this unique opportunity where Africans that are enslaved are having access to trade skills, education, learning. My own ancestor that came from West Africa to Jamaica, to Philadelphia, to Newport, at the age of 8, he's being trained as a Windsor chairmaker. But again, because being in Philadelphia and Newport, Windsor chairmaking was a much higher demand commodity than working in a cotton field. That wasn't happening in Philadelphia or Newport or Providence. So understanding this, these Africans had access to tools and opportunities that were unheard of for fellow Africans further south in the West Indies or South America. You also see a number of Africans being brought into the places of worship of master and mistress. We have reams of documentations of Africans, part of the Quaker meeting houses and taking on Quaker names and identities. In Newport, we have a number of Africans in Jewish households. They take on Jewish names, identities, and in 3 cases, 3 listed as Israelites. So this access to religion, training, and education, cohabitation, we don't call that integration, we call it interdependence. Very important difference. And it's this interdependence by the end of the 18th century, as the American Revolution ends, starting in 1777 in Vermont, and then sweeping across New England and the Northeast. Every single now new state in the United States of America either graduate or immediately emancipates. So by the end of the 18th century, you have for the first time that's never existed in the Americas, tens of thousands of free African heritage people. And in Providence, they're mostly co-located in the areas that we call today College Hill, sweeping up to Mount Hope. So it's important to recognize that this first emancipation becomes a significant indicator of how newly freed African heritage people are going to be treated. And we're not talking about the American South and West Indies, there's still slavery. If you're south of the Mason-Dixon line in 1800 and you're African heritage, you're largely enslaved. But if you're living in Philadelphia, New York, Bridgeport, Nashua, New Hampshire, Bristol, Providence, Newport, New Haven, New Bedford, you're free. So by the beginning of the 19th century, you see this incredible surge of free African heritage people who have access to education, training, religion, begin to build their own institutions. And in Providence, you start to see African community beginning to build their own neighborhoods and their own institutions. In fact, the oldest and first Black church in Rhode Island, one of the first in the country, Congress Street Baptist Church, established in 1819, evolves directly from an African Union Society that was established in 1789. In Newport, the first African Union Society is established in 1780. And then counterparts in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and they're all exchanging letters. One of the things we did in this research is that we began to pull out diaries, letters, and correspondence, and free Africans in Providence are talking to their counterparts in Boston. Prince Hall, who establishes the first free Prince Hall Masonic order, is talking to Africans in Providence, and they then form the second Prince Hall affiliated Masonic order in Providence. In Newport, they're talking to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, they're saying we're going to establish our own African churches. The first African Methodist Episcopal Church by Reverend Richard Allen was established in Philadelphia, and money from Providence and Newport Africans is given to him to help fund it and set that up. So the point is that by the early 19th century, African heritage people are free and are living relatively well-managed, interdependent lives in places like Providence, Rhode Island. And in our case in Providence, is places largely in the outskirts of town. In fact, the types of names these neighborhoods would receive, initially Squaws Hollow, then later Hardscrabble, and then later we see Snowtown. But what's most important is in the early 19th century, you have free Africans who are building institutions. On Meeting Street, they established one of the earliest public schools for African children. They're places to worship. So it's not a bad existence. But during that same time in the early 19th century, you're now seeing unincorporated cities becoming incorporated cities, forming political systems with mayors and councils, setting up departments, particularly would later become police departments, watchmen become police departments, fire service, fire watches become fire departments. And as these cities become sophisticated, we see a simultaneously within each community, Providence, Baltimore, Philadelphia, a set of policies and laws that begin to focus on and become concerned with these free African heritage communities. There's concern that they're free and they're going to compete for jobs. We're now moving into an industrial revolution. And we now have new waves of immigrants, Germans, Irish arriving in the early part of the 19th century. And there's a general concern within places like Providence. Are we beginning to share land, jobs, and prosperity with these free Africans? So you begin to see during this period of time, which is almost a Renaissance time in the early 19th century, and also a very significant time of public policies at a municipal, state, and federal level that begins to restrict the very lives. We're not talking about Jim Crow policies of the late 19th century South. We're talking about Jim Crow policies and traditions that are being established in places like Providence that begin to restrict and in some cases, even physically remove African heritage, life, and prosperity. I think all of us talk about the Tulsa race riot of 1920 because the commercial markets, the media focused upon it. Very few people would realize that 100 years before Tulsa, every major city in the Northeast, including Providence, had a series of racialized riots that deconstructed and nearly wiped out places of life, work, worship, for these African heritage people. In Providence, in 1824, the first community called Hardscrabble, it would have been located very close to the south lawn of the State House, and today where the train tracks are down the Canal Street. That was a great basin, and people were living around the basin in shanty homes and such, and then up the hill towards Orange Street. And in 1824, a series of 3-day riots destroyed much of that community. Those that remained and survived kind of moved up the hill a bit And then by 1831, those that moved up the hill a bit, landing in an area called Only Lane, very close to Only Street, North Main Street, down where the Marriott is, in an area that was sometimes called Snowtown, a second major riot. That riot was so large and so costly. By 1832, the city had decided to incorporate. First Mayor Brigham was organized and established. And in his speech, he specifically said that we will now organize our watchmen into what would become a police force, and we would pay specific attention to the unruliness of colored populations in this city, colored youth, and colored children. So as the very formation of a set of municipal policies, and particularly policing and law enforcement policies, African heritage people, called colored at that time, are being singled out as a group of residents, not citizens, of residents, to be watched, to be managed, and in some cases, to be enforced. So as we talk about today, the concerns of law enforcement in the larger African heritage community, it has its very roots in the very formation of law enforcement and formation of municipalities dating back to that antebellum era in the early 19th century. We also found in Providence, which was striking, I just want to talk about this for a second, this striking set of policies that are going on across New England, but are particularly being perfected in Providence. We know this because the City of Providence Archives has reams of primary documents, case laws, of what is called the warning out policy. At that time, there was a general concern, a lot of the Industrial Revolution is going on, immigration is going on. We just formed ourselves as a new nation, as a new municipality, and we got to kind of decide who's a citizen, who's a real resident, who should be a bona fide, rightful citizen, who should receive the benefits and services and basic life of living and working in this city. And it really goes to the city councils. The city councils determined, working with the watchmen, that they would determine who were bona fide residents and who were those who were just transients. And they would set a series of policies, which today we call loosely called warning out policies, where a watchman or a neighbor could recommend to a watchman or a council member or a public official that this person is a transit and that they do not have the right to live within this community. As we went and looked at over a 30-year period, reams of these warning out hearings and policies, what stood out is that a large share of the people coming before councils to be warned out are women, and particularly women of color, Indigenous women and African heritage women. And this is playing out not only in Providence, it's in Boston, it's in Newport, it's in Baltimore, New York. In fact, as you begin to read the primary documents, women of color living in Providence are warned out, and then they move to Narragansett, and then Narragansett warns them out and move back to Providence, and then Providence warns them out, and then they're up in Boston, they're offshore, then they're warned about, they're just trying to live. And we've pulled out testimonies from many of these women who are saying, I'm a widow, I have 3 kids. I've been operating in Only Lane, what we call an Airbnb, but a rooming house. And the response is, you're a woman of color, you don't have the right to have that license. So since you haven't operated with a license, since you haven't operated with a license, you're operating illegally, which causes a warning out, and now you're being asked to leave the community. We also find as a part of the warning out process, since there are many women, Indigenous and African heritage women and children, that children are being removed because they feel that they're unfit to manage their children. So we now see a policy of removing children from their birth mothers and placing them into indentured servitude. Slavery is outlawed. Slavery now evolves into indentured servitude. As I said, my own ancestor went from emancipation, and at 8, he's now indentured to a Quaker master chairmaker, Windsor chairmaker, and then he learns the trade, is indentured servant until he's 21. Fortunately, at 21, he has trade skills and capabilities he takes with him. But the point is that most people, when they think of New England and Rhode Island, the first thing they'll say is, we ended slavery first, well before the Emancipation Proclamation, well before the Civil War. No, we ended slavery and we just evolved it into indentured servitude. And we created a set of laws at a local, supported at a state and federal level that would support these actions to continually to oppress, restrict, and in some cases, enforce and incarcerate African heritage and Indigenous people. And let me just step back, because when we use the term African heritage, which is a term I introduced because, again, African American is not inclusive enough. As we get further into the history, African heritage includes anyone that's connected across the diaspora. You could be African born, have African heritage, you could be Cape Verdean, you could be like me, multiracial. We all share an African heritage. So the only thing that's different from my family versus someone in Puerto Rico, we're next to both trip from Africa. But we're all at some point tied back to West Africa through the diaspora. So we feel African heritage is more of an inclusive and more of an historically accurate interpretation of the history of a people who through creative survival still exist to this day. I also want to point out that the indigenous people that survived pestilence, their own enslavement, the King Philip's Wars, which wiped out a large number, really a massacre, because it's men, women, and seniors that are killed at the Great Swamp. Those that survived, in many cases, men who had survived were shipped off to the West Indies as slaves. In fact, in the Matter of Truth report, we pulled out from our own colonial records, Roger Williams, Thomas Onley led, immediately after the King Philip Wars of 1676, led a committee for the disposal of the surviving Indians, as they were called. And men were sold off largely to the West Indies to remove any threat of native uprising. And what's remarkable about that passage in those documentation, Roger Williams himself took one of the boys, a native boy, and named him Will. The remaining native women, for the most part, who have been sharing spaces and work both enslaved and indentured servitude with Africans, begin intermarrying with Africans. So by the 19th century, a large percentage of African heritage people also share indigenous heritage. And if it wasn't for their intermixing, the indigenous people may have died out. And again, I always say this facetiously because we have this heritage. When you look at Wampanoags in Massachusetts, Narragansetts here, Pequots in Connecticut, they tend to look more like me than Plains Indians. That's just a testament of their creative survival. But it's important that we understand this histories because African heritage, indigenous people were equally discriminated against and were seen as a separate race. In fact, the term mulatto, which is the mixed heritage person, in the case of Rhode Island census that we reviewed, a mulatto is almost always an indigenous African heritage mixture. Very rarely did you see a white indigenous or a white African, very, very rare. It happened, but not where the levels where I think most people, I think of mixed heritage, they tend to think of the American South in the 19th and 20th century of a black-white mixture. No, in New England, it's a different circumstance. It's important to understand that because it would set the stage as the Narragansetts would try to exercise their sovereignty and their authority. The leadership in Rhode Island and province would simply say, you don't look Indian, you're not Indian, you're black, or you're Negro. Now we've gone from African colored to Negro, you're Negro. And in 1880, the Rhode Island General Assembly met with support from the city of Providence and abolished the Narragansett tribe formally. And they had a set of hearings where an entirely white male group would ask Native people to come before them and justify and present their case of why they were sovereign Narragansetts. And in every case, the response was, you look Negro, we believe you're Negro. They actually called the small settlement that they still had left in Charleston a Negro settlement. They used race, they weaponized race for the sole purpose of detribalizing the Narragansetts and justifying the taking of all the land. And I want to be clear here, I'll go off record a bit. One of the great challenges that we have today, and I strongly support the Narragansett people and tribe, is that they are every single day making sure that we all recognize who they are and their identity. Don't call us this, don't call us that. We are proud Narragansett indigenous people, no more, no less. And once you start to introduce other tribes and other concepts, it becomes that age-old divide and conquer that has been weaponized against them that they have fought for. And to this very day, will fight for. So it becomes even more of a challenge for us as we present this history, because it also demonstrates not only racialized discrimination that's had significant negative ongoing impacts on indigenous and African heritage people, it's also created lots of concern, lots of less than agreements between our own intergroups on who should receive benefits. Is it an African-American person? Is it an African heritage person? Is it a Narragansett? Is it a Wampanoag? Is it a Pokanoa? Is it someone living in Charleston or someone living in Fox Point, Providence? What counts? Who should be eligible? I can't even begin to tell you how difficult those conversations are as we begin to talk to many groups who clearly have faced historical discrimination and still to this very day, but we're all trying to determine what that eligibility should be. And at the end, I'll kind of talk about how we're trying to approach it. And I just want to emphasize this again, this weaponization of the Negro blood for the Narragansett people. And it was going on in Canada with the Pequots, those remaining in the Wampanoags, that this use of Negro blood as a determination that any current present Narragansett or indigenous person in 1880 or 1920 or 1930 or today is very much a New England version of the Jim Crow laws. One drop of Negro blood in the American South and you're black, you're not white. So you don't have the right to vote, don't have the right to share a water fountain, don't have the right to go to school, you have no rights. So again, I want to emphasize for us in New England to have the audacity when we talk about racism and point to the South. The Jim Crow laws of the South were the Negro blood and one drop laws that were going on well into the 20th century, right here in places like Providence, Newport, Pawtucket, Charleston, Hopkinton, right here in New England. And I think what I'm trying to present here is that this racialized discrimination starts with indigenous land taking and the enslavement of Africans, and then later the suppression of free African and indigenous people who have the audacity to want to have all the rights of all citizens. But in the 20th century, it takes on a whole new level of dynamics. In fact, one of the things that we introduced in this study that others around the state have not looked at is the 20th century racialized discrimination policies, which are very modern, are very near-term history. I've had a number of people call me, email me, text me and say, I'm Italian, my family came here in 1920, we have nothing to do with slavery, I don't want to talk about this reparations. I hear that all the time. And my response is that what we're talking about in this report is the history and the evolution of racialized discrimination. Was your family here in 1925, 1930? Oh yeah, they were. Did your grandfather serve in World War II? Yes, he did, probably. And when he got out, did he have access to the GI Bill? Yes, he did. And we bought our first house and he had access to school. He went to Rhode Island College. I said, if you were black, now we're black, and you served in World War II, you weren't eligible for the GI Bill. And there was no fair housing, fair employment laws. So you had little to no choices where you could live or work. I had my dad and 3 uncles served in World War II in combat. My youngest uncle was a famous Tuskegee Airman. He died 2 months before his 21st birthday. 20 years old. So it's important to recognize as we now talk about 20th century racialized discrimination, we're not talking about slavery, indentured servitude. We're talking about employment discrimination, housing discrimination. We're talking about policies such as redlining, which even to this day plays out in many neighborhoods. And it really spent the redlining policies of the 1930s and 40s that accelerated into the mid 20th century had as much to do in shaping and creating ghettoized, racialized, ghettoized neighborhoods across America. And just to step back, for anyone who may not know, redlining is a policy where during the New Deal and the FDR policies to really invest ourselves out of the Depression and to particularly to provide direct investments in lower middle class populations to give them an opportunity to become solidly middle class. I think they knew then, we know today, one of the fastest tracks of economic security and financial stability and middle class life is owning a home. And it would be the establishment of the Housing and Urban Development Department in a variety of financing, insured, guaranteed instruments that would guarantee loans, both personal loans, home loans, and business loans that would provide this access. And millions of Americans, largely white Americans, would benefit from this. But as a part of the process of investing in neighborhoods and engaging people to own a home and own a property and build equity, there was a process that came out of that began to set a very specific racialized standard on who should receive federal insurance, which would open the gates to a loan, and what communities should receive those benefits, where it should be built and supported. And a process called redlining that we know today began to emerge. And redlining very simply was a process where there's this collaboration between local realtors, local financial institutions, insurers, attorneys, who began to, within their states and communities and cities, predetermine what communities were high risk or what populations were high risk and what were not. And this red line was a process where they would draw literally lines around certain neighborhoods that they felt were high risk neighborhoods and would not be conducive to receive a federal insurance or an investment for ownership. And in the case of Providence, and this was going on across the country, but in the case of Providence, the red line neighborhoods were neighborhoods today that we recognize as Fox Point, Mount Hope, Silver Lake, Holyville, parts of Smith Hill, parts of College Hill, Blackside College Hill.
Where are you right?
And what was remarkable at that time is that during the 30s and early 40s of this redlining policies, many of those neighborhoods had properties that were owned by people of color, largely women, had businesses operating there. One of the things we did in the Matter of Truth report is we put together a comprehensive assessment of all of the Black-owned businesses in Lippet Hill. Lippet Hill today would be found as University Heights, founded by Doyle Avenue, Olney Street, Camp Street, a little bit into Hope Street, down off Main Street. We documented 72 Black-owned businesses in 1950. By the end of redlining processes and urban renewal, each and every one of those businesses disappeared. So it's important to understand that the racialized discrimination that starts with land taking and enslavement evolves into the 20th century in racialized discrimination policies, of race and ethnicity, and then later religion as new groups are arriving. And it restricted people from access to homes, access to businesses, and access to even just basic choices. This right here is a 1934 red line map of Providence. That was the official red line map that's in the city archives. And it's hard to see, but you can see the neighborhoods that are being redlined, which are ironic. Many of the neighborhoods today who are still facing significant social economic disruptions. In fact, just to give you kind of a modern day layer of impact, the Onlyville neighborhood was redlined. So people of largely color, newly arriving immigrants did not have the luxury or the basic right to have access to federally insured mortgages, insurance, and support programs. So that community was never able to kind of pick itself up in the people within. Today, Onlyville had one of the highest COVID infection rates in the state, if not the highest. If I was to layer a whole wide variety of socioeconomic demographics within Onlyville, childhood poverty, unemployment rates, it's significant. So what's striking to me is, and again, 80% of the people in Onlyville are largely people of color. So what's striking to me is that the racialized policies that started in the 17th and 18th century and took root in the 20th century worked, because it has kept people of color in largely historic neighborhoods where they lived, worked, and worshiped on the outside looking in from any level of basic prosperity living in the city of Providence in 2022. I just have to go back to this because urban renewal was the follow-along to redlining. And James Baldwin, the very famous 20th century African heritage author, was the first to coin urban renewal as Negro removal. Because what we were seeing in Providence, in places like Lippet Hill and Fox Point, was going on in every major city of the country. In fact, my city of Newport, it completely wiped out the African heritage community in what is today called historic Hill Yachting Village. Was completely wiped out because the entire neighborhood was dissected by a boulevard, Memorial Boulevard, to connect it to the waterfront and the tourism economy. And most of those homes up and down that area were Black-owned homes that were deconstructed, or in some cases, like in the case of the Providence Preservation Society here, the Newport Restoration Foundation stepped in and acquired them for $1, converted them, restored them as historic properties, but certainly didn't sell them back into the Black or limited income communities. So it's important to recognize that this Negro removal policy in the 20th century, under the guise of urban renewal, continued to deconstruct largely African heritage in limited income communities. And it took place in Providence, significantly in places like Lippet Hill. And in fact, one of the things that we did was to take a very strong look at the Lippet Hill, because with significant documentation around that. And we now know that close to 400 families, African heritage families, were displaced in a very short period of time, a 5-year period. And just to have a sense of this was all happening in the late 50s into the early 60s. Rhode Island didn't have a fair housing law signed by Governor Chafee and led by a coalition of Black, white, Christian, Jewish leaders until 1965. So if you were displaced from your home before 1965, you had no legal recourse if you were looking to live somewhere else, or even had a choice to live somewhere else. So what we found is that the urban renewal policies of Providence that started to deconstruct in limited access and living in places like Lippet Hill, Mount Hope, Olyville, Silver Lake, Fox Point, the only places that people of color could end up relocating because of the lack of fair housing legislation was South Providence. We literally ghettoized South Providence. We, meaning we as all citizens and governments, local, state, and federal, we ghettoized South Providence in the 60s. So it's always fascinating to me as someone who's been a Rhode Island scholar, whereas many of you should know, the very early origins of South Providence have an Irish and Jewish roots. Today, people wouldn't recognize that. But it's important to understand that South Providence, because of very targeted urban renewal, racialized displacement policies, would only allow people displaced from other urban renewal areas, particularly the east side, to live on places like Prairie Avenue and Dudley and Blackstone, Connors, those areas of South Providence. And this devastating consequence, I just want to show you, we've been putting together a series of GIS maps. This is Lippet Hill as it looked in 1952. So you see in the bottom right, that's Hope High School, it's still there. My late aunt was a graduate of 1942 there, part of the Gross family. Her uncle was one of the first Black doctors, Dr. Gross. They lived on Only Street. We're all part of a very prominent upper middle, solid middle class families that lived in that community for generations. So that's Hope High School lower. You see at the left what is North Main Street, and then a very densely compacted neighborhood. Lots of multifamily structures, very Providence. And this is what it looks like in 1962 after urban renewal. It's like a bomb, an atomic bomb. It's like a Hiroshima. Everything is wiped clean from the map. So every home, every business, every place of worship is obliterated. And those men, women, and families, if they wanted to remain in Rhode Island, their single choice was South Providence, regardless of their economic status, regardless of their interest, capabilities, or even choice, because anywhere else would have been off limits to them. So this is a graphic physical reminder that racialized discrimination doesn't start with slavery or to just land taking. It continues, and it continues to this very day. So I want to just, end here because I've got 5 minutes and talk about the next steps, because again, I apologize deeply. There's so much more in the Matter of Truth report. And there's so much more that, we're looking to share. But the next steps are this. Now that we have this research and this history, the mayor has now moved into forming a municipal reparations commission. The commission is now set by executive order. We meet each week. It is comprised of men and women who represent a wide swath of Providence, private, public, religious, social service organizations, and just plain citizens who care. And they're going to be charged over the next month or so to take this research and come up with a deliberate recommendation of investment and how we can develop a reparations investment strategy for the city of Providence. Now, what we've done, which is unique and interesting, there's 2 unique things we've done. One, we're taking a much more comprehensive history. We didn't start and end with slavery. We're expanding it across generations and across centuries. 2, we're looking to set the stage by beginning the investment strategy with an initial $10 million investment through federal opera funds. Now, that's unique, and we've had national organizations come and talk to us about that. They're fascinated about that, and we did it for 2 reasons. One, we know the highly politically charged nature of government, and we know the R word, reparations, has its own level of emotionalism and political challenges. So we didn't want to tie a reparations strategy and a budget into localized dollars or state dollars. One, because the city of Providence is struggling like any urban community, and we have to continue to prioritize affordable housing, good schools, safe neighborhoods. Those are all priorities we have to work with. And 2, we didn't quite know where the state would respond to this. So the opera funds gave us an ability to create a platform of starting an investment strategy, where we as a commission will identify programs, policies, investment options that can be built upon through the 10 million and then scaled up with further public-private partnerships. We feel that the programs that we recommend that we can establish could stand on their own and would engage and encourage other public-private participation and work within it. We're excited about that. That's already happened. I mean, to be candid, we're already having a number of private foundations, institutions, private citizens, federal, state entities calling and saying, this is something we're interested in. We'd like to talk about this. So let me end there. I'll spend 5 minutes answering any questions you might have. I apologize for rushing through it. It's a lot of information. I know that Quentin Nod from our African-American Ambassador Group for the Mayors here, he's brought a case of the Matter of Truth books. So please read them. Get back to us, get back to me personally. I'd love to be able to provide more information on how this is being built, how the data has been assembled. My final point is that when I talk about reparations and when I begin to define what I think reparations are, I see it as simply in 2022, closing the racial wealth equity gap. If I was to define reparations, I would say reparations and all the things that was involved, from slavery to land taking, redlining to urban renewal. The one thing we know measurably that it has done, it has significantly reduced the equity and financial stability of African heritage indigenous people. So we think the obligation today is to close that racial wealth equity gap and allow any citizen or resident of Providence an option of owning a home, an option of having a good job, good training, good education, regardless of where they live. So that's how we're approaching it, and that's how we're defining it. And again, it'll be the commission over the course of the next month and a half that'll be deliberating, delivering what we think is going to be a very exciting set of recommendations. So again, thank you for having me. I'll try to answer any quick questions quickly before I rush off to the next. Thank you. My great friend, Rob. Hey, Rob.
Keith, thank you for doing this. I've heard you multiple times now on this topic, and I've learned something new every time. And thank you so much for doing this. On your last point, I find as a middle-aged white guy, I spend the first half of these conversations with my peers talking about what the word reparations means. Is there a way to use a better word, or a word that makes the conversation? I don't want to soften it, so we need to make it easier for the white community. I understand the danger of doing that, but it takes so much oxygen out of the discussion because you start with a negative premise that we're talking about restoration, reconciliation, a bunch of other R words, and not just stroking checks.
Yeah, Rob, you're bringing up an excellent point. We're all wrestling with this, and that ultimately will have to be a decision of the commission. I tend to be more pragmatic because I tend to be someone who just wants to get things done. And words have less meanings to me. I see it as, again, I'm almost significantly saying closing the racial equity gap, because once I make that statement, I can bring a body of data and documentation, and I can layer it by neighborhood, by population, by ethnicities, and make a clear case of the fact that if we're going to make an investment, Blackstone neighborhood may not be the priority, but Onlyville is, Washington Park is, and the people who live in those communities, and I can layer a lot of documentation around that. So I'm not using reparations. I'm using, again, that racial wealth equity gap, which is definable and discernible, and hopefully takes the emotion out of that. I also tend to recommend people I'm very proud that my kids have had access to a great education and a great life. And I would want any child to have access to a great education and a great life. And if that means doing better with Providence school systems, shouldn't we all agree to do that? If that means making neighborhoods safe, regardless of your zip code, shouldn't we do that? So I try to appeal to people on a very personal basis, which we all care about. We love the city. We love the state. We want our children and our children's children to be able to prosper here. But the reality is that that's not happening for a variety of reasons that we all are complicit to, and we all have a responsibility to step forward and invest in.
Keith, that's fantastic. Every time I hear like all kinds of things, can you briefly, I know you think about this, the overlay of Jewish heritage in that history you just described? I know because we've talked about Trio Synagogue like so many times. I'm thinking about, as I'm listening to you, our family, my wife Susan's family. And I mean, this temple was in South Providence. Everybody came up into, from there up to the area you just showed us. So like two things. One, comment on the overlay and what can we or should we as a community be thinking about to be part of this conversation?
You know, you should have me back. That's a whole discussion we do at Turtle Center.
Consider it done.
Um, First of all, what's striking is that, and I had said this, and we had something there a few years ago, the leadership of the fair housing was led by the Fain family and led by this congregation in conjunction with many other congregations. They led that effort. And that's documented. And that needs to be better understood today going forward. What I hear from a number of African heritage professionals and people today is, and I'll be very candid, what I hear today is, you know, the Jewish community was right there side by side with us during the civil rights era. The 50s, 60s, they were right there. They were marching with us, they were contributing with us, they took rocks in the head with us, they would die with us. Today, not so much. So what I hear today is that for whatever reason, over the last 50 years, and I'll speak candidly, what I hear is Jewish people got their civil rights and got their freedom and choices and don't need us anymore. So I want to be clear with that statement. It's not a sense of discrimination or anti-Semitism I'm hearing. It's a sense of almost a sigh. The one group that was on our side is not on our side. The one group that knew what it was like to be discriminated against, to be harassed, to be treated in the worst circumstance. Now we don't know if they're on our side because they're living, their temple is not in South Providence, it's here. So I hear that on a consistent basis, and I say that candidly and with all humbleness because I have foot in both levels. I mean, they say that to me because I know who I am and my heritage and such. And I think there's an opportunity here, if not through this process, through other process, to get back to the table and have some honest dialogue again. Because I do feel that there's a significant feeling that we've been left behind a bit and we're kind of out there on our own on these issues. And I think there's an opportunity for us to come together, have this dialogue, learn together, most importantly, build a better city and a better state for all of us, regardless of race, religion, and all that foolishness. So I have to apologize. I've got to go. So
we understand. No, thank you, Keith. I every time you speak, I learn something new.
But I'm going to leave it to Judy. And
absolutely. And before I just everyone online, stay with us because we're going to continue the conversation. I saw someone put in the chat, how can we support this? That's our next part of our conversation. So, but thank you, Keith.
Thank you. So the answer to your question is that's why, frankly, I had the idea to bring the program here, was to reverse that, you know, to try to bring us back together. I'm Judy Kay. I belong to Temple Emmanuel. I live on the east side. I sent my kids to Providence public schools, and there were almost no Jews in the public schools, right? When I was growing up, the line I heard was, it was the public schools that made Jewish success possible in America, right? It was the melting pot, it was mixing all the immigrants, and we had access to free education. And then, you know, as a community, we did have, believe we did benefit from having white skin and didn't encounter the kinds of barriers that you heard about. So we were, many of us were able to climb that economic ladder. And, you know, in the 80s and 90s, I don't know if you remember, but the strong Jewish neoconservative movement that began to take stands against affirmative action. And, you know, really moved in a different direction, although there have always been Jews who have worked on and cared about anti-racism and anti-poverty issues all along, including in our own community. And you're part of the Coalition Against Poverty. And yet clearly there's a lot that we could do. So, after George Floyd, so I work as a diversity professional. I do workshops on sexual harassment prevention and diversity and inclusion. I'm a lawyer by training, but I left law about 30 years ago. And after George Floyd, I was looking particularly to get involved in a Black-led effort to address some of the racial inequities that we're talking about, and heard about the African American Ambassadors Group, which was started by the mayor right after COVID started, initially to look at the racial disparities in COVID impact. And then when George Floyd happened, this African-American ambassador group existed and said, hey, wait a minute, all these other inequities are happening. Isn't there something we can do about that too? So they sort of pivoted and took on a broader agenda. And that group is open to anybody. So I just signed up to be a member of the African-American Ambassadors Group. It's not exclusive to people of African heritage, but I will tell you that for the first year, I didn't open my mouth. I just listened, right? I wanted to support what they were doing. I wanted to learn about it. I wanted to hear about it. That's how I heard about the Matter of Truth report and the whole process. And then they have subcommittees. I put a few sheets on each table, and people who are on Zoom, we can get the information out to you via email, or just go to the website. We call it the AAAG, the African American Ambassador Group. The website is aagpvd.com. Is that right, Quentin? Quentin is the lead coordinator of the African American Ambassador Group for the city. He's a city employee. And we have subcommittees, and the one I was drawn to was the Truth and Reconciliation Subcommittee, because I'm a sort of people diplomacy person, but there's subcommittees on food disparities, housing insecurity, arts and culture, youth, police accountability. There are a lot of different subgroups. So those of you who are asking, how can I get involved? If you're a policy person, if you're interested in these issues, one way you might be able to get involved is through one of these subcommittees, or perhaps you're associated with an institution or an organization that could bring this program and educate more people about it. It doesn't have to just be confined to the synagogue. People here who teach or in professional associations, if you're in your neighborhood association, contact us. Keith has done a video version of this presentation, which obviously can't be as good as him in person. He's just remarkable, isn't he? But he does have a 20-minute recorded version of it that we can bring to start off a conversation. And we also have a short video where some current people who have lived through what he described, so current mixed heritage, African heritage, indigenous folks in Providence, some of whom you may know, names of whom are very well known, who had lived through the urban renewal on the east side. By the way, that area, is where University Heights is, in case anybody couldn't figure that out. And most of the people who were displaced by University Heights could not afford to move back into University Heights and could not live anywhere else in the city except South Providence. And you heard that story. If they lost their house because of the previous discrimination, their house wasn't worth anything. So they, the city demolished their house for $1 or whatever. So then they didn't have the means to take that next step. So I think those are a lot of the dots that many of us weren't taught how they connected to the inequities that we see today. So we can help connect those dots for a lot of our friends and colleagues, particularly who are white, who don't know this history. Although I would tell you, a lot of Black people don't know the history either. I have a good friend who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who's African American, and he did not know about the Tulsa race riot, until all the rest of us found out about it. So we're all, miseducated or undereducated around this. So that's one way you can get involved. We have about maybe 20 copies, would you say, Quentin, in that box? We got a grant from the Jewish Alliance. Quentin, the AAAG, and Rabbi Mack approached the Alliance for a micro grant. Temple Emmanuel congregation, that's Shalom, joined in as well. So we brought this program to all 3 of the Providence synagogues. We underwrote, we bought copies of the reports for you from the Black Heritage Society, which you're welcome to take. You can buy more directly from the Black Heritage Society if you like. I think they're $20 or less. I think what we'll do is if you're interested in following up on this, I put sign-up sheets on the tables, and if you're on the Zoom call, can they put their email address in the chat? You're going to preserve the chat, right?
We will preserve
Or
the
we'll
chat.
send it to everybody
We'll
else.
send it to anyone who registered through the website.
Okay.
If you didn't register, make sure to put your name down. and
Yeah,
we'll add
if you
you to
didn't
the list.
register for this event,
But if you registered, we'll send the link to the report and the handouts and follow-up information.
right, we can send a link. We can send you the PowerPoint as well.
We'll
but
hold copies of the report at Temple, though, for
Yes.
anyone on Zoom as well, for anyone on Zoom who would
pick
like
it
to
up.
swing by and pick
Right.
it up.
But I think what we'll do, because there was a lot of interest at all 3 synagogues, I think we'll have a follow-up event in maybe in June or July, and we haven't figured out a date. And I know not everybody who came to this will be able to come to that, but we'll pick a date. We'll invite everybody from all 3 synagogues to come back together to continue this conversation of what can we do now, right? What can we do in the Jewish community? What can we do as individuals? And we'll see if we can get Keith back, or we can pull some strings. and see if we can get Keith back and have more of that conversation. So I can entertain, Quentin, you want to come up with me and introduce yourself? Quentin, we had an African-American ambassador group meeting. We meet 3 out of 4 weeks of the month, and we meet Thursday morning. So Quentin, I think, got probably waylaid by a community member who wanted to talk your ear off, right? So you want to introduce yourself,
Yes.
then we can take any questions that we can answer before we adjourn.
Good afternoon at this point, right? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Quentin Nard. I am the African American Ambassador Group Lead Coordinator for the City of Providence, work for Mayor Alorza. And first of all, let me start off by apologizing for my tardiness. I got held up in a lot of conversations, and everyone I was looking at with very intense eyes as I have to go. And I have somewhere else to be. But I'm glad to be here and to catch it. As you all have said already, every time I hear Mr. Keith speak, it is something. I told him, I said, man, you're the next greatest thing to the Bible. Because, you know, it's just like, just reveal, you know, something new every time. And I am. I'm on side, I do pastor.
Dad.
Yes, 7-week-old. So yeah. Yeah. Everyone says that there's this energy that comes over me only during the day. When I get home, it's like it's over, and I'm like out of it. But I want to say this, and then yes. First of all, about the Matter Truth Report, we have copies. Please help yourself to a copy, and take that with you. If you need more copies, the city, we have them. Yes, you can purchase them through the Black Heritage Society. You can reach them and purchase them, but also we have them accessible as well, and you can get a copy. And we have some with us today. I did see some comments in the chat, and if there are individuals that need anything, you can contact me at my email address, which is qnard@providenceri.gov. I'll say it again. It's qnard, QNARD @providenceri.gov, and I'll be able to assist you and help you with anything. I'm just glad to be here. This is a beautiful space. I met Rabbi Mac and the other rabbi the other month. I'm just glad to be here. Essentially, right, this is a matter of social justice and, you know, doing what's right, you know, for people. And yes, this is particular to the African American community. But, you know, that's what this is all about. That's what this is all about. And so even talking about efforts to move forward, we can, you know, ask if there are any questions. I know one of the things, and I'll say this, and we'll be glad to try to answer as many questions as we can. But one of the things is that, as Mr. Keith stated, the $10 million is an investment. It's an initial investment. It's also a drop in the bucket. It's not something really that is, you know, a great amount. And so what is going to be approached even now is how can we then get other people to partner in and chime along here and maybe match those dollars, or even come with some type of you know, a substantial amount that would, you know, assist in the efforts that are being done to help build the community,
I wanted to appreciate Diana Fox's comment about also reminding us of the intersectionality between Blacks and Jews, because there are many people who have both identities as well.
Correct.
Any quick comments or questions? And Sarah, maybe keep your eye on the chat box.
Absolutely, and I do see, thank you, Diane, for sharing your story in the chat. And if Joey can also put us on gallery mode, and if anybody in the chat has something to say, or if you want to raise your hand, you can feel free to engage as well. But we're grateful for this opportunity, and grateful also for next steps. I feel like this is the beginning of a journey together, and we're just really so grateful that we can grateful that we can begin this conversation and move forward together. So.
Yeah, we know.
I have one question
Yep.
for you guys or follow up with Mr. Stokes after. There's a quote from Roger Williams down in the National Park in Providence, and he says, sort of cautions to all his people who he brought in with his small colony in Providence. That the Native Americans who were there are equal brothers under God. They are the same as us in every way. And assuming he believed that, and that, he had his deal in terms of how they were going to pay in trade goods for their state that they took or were given and traded for. It would seem that his view on things and people who were not white was, gracious, benevolent, whatever good word you want to put on it. I just wondered, like in reading the report, I saw a lot of positive commentary around Roger Williams. I didn't see a lot of negative, which is fine and good. But I didn't really see or understand when did this colony go sideways? Right? Like how did we as a colony get to the point where Native Americans were treated as lesser other? How did we get to the point where we had slave trade in Newport? Like that, there must have been a figure or a break point or an influence that came in that, Roger Williams himself or the government that he created couldn't sustain.
If I can, one of the things that I, when reading the report about that, and this is just only one thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah.
That I think there are probably many reasons that kind of put a wedge in between what was a partnership initially. But one of the things that I saw that was highlighted or lifted up, and I've heard Mr. Keith speak about, is religious beliefs. That, when you talk about these colonies that come from Europe and from, the Eastern world, they had beliefs that dictated, right, their government and their system and their society. And I think that, and along with also other individuals in powers, and just allow for those things to kind of like continue to guide and lead them, and direct them as to what should be and what should not be.
Right.
Of course, I think there's many factors where we have a genuine feeling, of, okay, hey, let's all together come together and, and work together, but then allow for other outside forces and ideas and concepts to then begin to put that wedge in between. And I really think that is, what I understand and what I've read, has cause for it to kind of like, just begin to separate and change the dynamic of the relationships, change the way it was being done. One of the things that I'll say this, and that's your hand, is one of the things that stuck out to me was that one drop rule, so let me back up for a minute. I'm not Providence born and raised. I'm born and raised from New Orleans, Louisiana. And so I know the history of the South racism and being something completely different. And then what I would learn as far as what the northern states experience or what life was like. And I always say, in my opinion, that, I come up here and I'm like, I thought it was going to be a little different. But I was like, it's kind of back of the woods, just like we are, and the South, just in a different way. But our perception always was that the North was just, and it's the same thing. It's like I learned from Mr. Keith, slavery was, and I'm just making this point to what you were saying. Slavery was one thing here, or racism, I should say, was one thing here versus what it was in the South. People free, Africans free, indigenous people free, but not allowed to live at the same pleasures and experience the same type of life as their counterparts. So that's just my thought.
So I'm just gonna zoom out a little bit, back to your comment, your question, when did the Roger Williams belief system go south? When did that unravel? I am
South, literally.
trying to, I look back historically, the great arc of history, there is no evidence that I am aware of any white Anglo-Saxon group going to another country, especially of natives or people of color, and living in harmony with them. We don't have that model.
Right.
It does not exist. We take over, we hurt, we intrude, all the above. So that's all that we have to rely on. That's what white people do.
Well, that's what people do.
That's what people do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what
our propensity to dominate the
Yes.
competition. Yeah, I'm not sure it ever was as rosy as we painted.
Exactly.
You know, it was always just like the United States, you know, the conflict we have right now where people feel like some of our, yelling about these issues is somehow against the United States and, want to go back to some time when we didn't have these problems. We always had problems, right? And it's both and, right? With many things that are wonderful and miraculous about the American democracy, and it was always flawed. It was always imperfect. It always wasn't inclusive. And what you had happening, as far as I understand, simultaneous with all these developments, was the development of science and beginning to create justifications around racial, pseudoscience around racial differences. Because how else are you going to justify enslaving a people? You could say these people are made in our image, but they're still inferior, right? And we're doing them a favor by converting them to Christianity. We're doing them a favor by giving them the structured life of, slavery. I mean, all these rationalizations that got embedded in pseudoscience were influencing everybody, right? At the same period of time, and all over Europe, and not just in North America, and influencing what happened in Spain when Jews. We might have been the first racialized group, right? I think it was almost like a one-drop rule in Spain, I believe, around the time of the expulsion and the Inquisition. How do we know who was how are we going to uproot the heretics? The reading I've done about that, there were pure blood laws passed in Spain, which blew my mind because I didn't know about them. So, but these are so there's so many factors. These are such complex conversations. We just need to be talking a lot more about it. Trying to think if there was one more thing I wanted to share before we finished about what you could do or who you should contact. Oh, I put a few sheets on each table with a little bit of history about the AAAG, the African American Ambassador Group. If you want to get involved, but you can just go to that website I mentioned, AAAGPVD.com. We'll try to have a follow-up event.
I just also wanted to share that the commission that Mr. Keith was speaking about meets on Mondays at the 444 Westminster Street.
And on Zoom.
And they meet on Zoom. And we can get that information to you as well if you want to join those meetings, listen in. They also provide space for public comment and feedback to those meetings, but they're held at 1 o'clock. This one coming is 1 o'clock Monday. There is a Zoom link. You also can find that information on the website, the AAAGPVD.com website. There's a tab that says Providence Municipal Reparations Commission. And you'll be able to go to that and they'll provide all the information for how you can be a part of those meetings or how you can tune in and click on the Zoom link or whatever. That's also another way that you can get engaged by learning and being engaged with the conversations that the commission are having. And then also, sharing that with others.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you,
for
Judy,
having
and thank
us.
you, everyone. We'll follow up with, and I see Joey has placed that website in the chat as
Great.
well. And also we've recorded the entirety, so that will
great.
remain on our website,
Terrific.
and the link will be shareable. We'll make sure to share that as well in case people miss parts. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you as always to Joey for
Thank you,
seamless
Joey.
technology. Not a single, we couldn't hear you. Grateful for that.